Hi everyone, my name is Sophie. I'm an MS3 here at UCLA, DGSOM. I'm part of the MSTP program and I will be your panelist today. We're going to be talking all things med school interviews, and you have a bunch of wonderful panelists here to answer all of your questions and are ready to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Annie. I'm an MS1 in the MD program here at DGSOM. I'm from Los Altos, California, so up near San Francisco, and I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and super excited to be chatting with you guys today.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also in the traditional MD track at DGSOM. I'm an MS1. I'm from Hillsborough, California, so like 15 minutes from where Annie's from. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm a first year at DGSOM in the traditional MD program. I'm from Fresno, California, and I also went to UC Berkeley for undergrad.
Hi everyone, my name is Ilana. I use she, her pronouns. I am an MS1 here at UCLA in the traditional MD program. I'm from Santa Cruz and I went to UCLA for undergrad, so sticking around for a little bit longer. And yeah, really excited to be here and answer any questions you guys have.
Randy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, y'all. Great to meet you. My name is Randy Sai. I use he, him pronouns. I am a third year MD MBA student, currently doing the MBA program here at UCLA Anderson. Happy to talk about my experience. Grew up in Taiwan, but moved over to Northern California when I was pretty young. Bounced around California for all my life. Went to school in UC San Diego. Now I'm here at UCLA.
Nice to meet everyone. So kind of how today's going to go in terms of questions is we're going to talk kind of like before the interview, resources, things like that you can use to prepare, things to do before and after, during and after the interview. And then I'm also going to try and get as many of the questions that are asked in the RSVP form, as well as if you guys have any questions in the Q&A that I think that should be highlighted as well. So the first question that I have for you guys is, what resources did you guys use to prepare for your interviews and what was the most helpful?
I can start. I prepared mostly with like in-person or Zoom practices. So I would go and I'd send either my PI that I was working for at the time or someone who like volunteered to help practice interview me, just a page like the 100 most common med school interview questions, and just have them fire random ones at me and make sure that I was equipped to handle anything that came towards me, and also that I'd be comfortable with a curveball if it came. So ended up working really well, and I think it was a great strategy.
I can add on to that. I did something similar to Jordan. I also, there's a few like websites where you can find common questions that the medical school that you'll be interviewing at typically asks. So depends on what stage you are in the interview cycle. If you're like in the very beginning, there may not be that much information on the type of questions that they're asking for this year. But if you're interviewing in like October or November, and there's already been a few interviews that have been completed, you can search your school. I would look like at UCLA common interview questions, and then there's like Reddit and Student Doctor Network, and there's like a whole plethora of like websites that you can reference. And on those pages, it'll say like very common questions that the school likes to ask. I feel like a general trend I found is that schools like to ask questions that are somewhat tied to their mission statement. So if a school is very heavy on like community service or research, or like UCLA really emphasizes like the cultural North Star, there's like little aspects of a school that they have in their mission statement that I think they ask a lot of questions about that like tie into that. So I think prepping for stuff along those lines.
Yeah, and then just to add on to that, in terms of more preparation versus practice, one of the biggest resources I used was current students at the school I was interviewing at. So when I got an interview invite, I would honestly just like go on LinkedIn and DM random people or see if I had mutual connections with med students at that school, or like try to find some kind of connection online to get connected with those students and then use them as a resource, because I think through med students, you're going to get a really good perspective on things that you can't find about a school on their website or in a different way. And they can also give you some insight into the things that the school really values and things they might ask you about, as well as give you more intel on things you can talk about and bring up during the interview.
Those were all really helpful, and I wish I'd known a bit more about those things too. A couple of questions that were asked in the RSVP form are in terms of like specific resources for ethics questions and where to find those. I don't know if you guys had any additional resources. I know that UW has a beautiful website where they go through all of the ethical questions and kind of like the ethical principles behind all of those subjects. That is really helpful. But if you guys have any other resources that you want to add, feel free.
Yeah, if there's a particular situation that maybe comes up in an ethics question that you really feel stuck about, something I did is I went to the AMC's website and looked at what their guidelines were in that specific situation. So that was really helpful to see like procedurally how that might work, or the hospital I was working at, I would see what their strategy was like and really try to figure out the reasoning behind the decisions that they make.
That's a really good one too, looking at the resources where you work. The next question I have, and I kind of jumped the gun with the first one, but is what kind of interviews are there usually for medical schools, and what kind of questions do they usually ask during those interviews, and are there any differences between the interview types?
I could get us started with this one. I think that one question that I got a lot, regardless of sort of the type of interview that it was, whether it was MMI, traditional, or even group interviews, was tell me about yourself. And that was a huge one that like threw me for a loop, because I was like, what do I say about myself? So definitely have some sort of plan planned out for what you want to say. What is the point that you want to get across? What is something that if someone were to take away from meeting you for like 20 or 30 minutes, what's like the one thing that you definitely want them to know about yourself? I think that's really good to sort of put in there as just your one-liner for this is who I am, this is what I want people to remember me by. In terms of MMIs and traditional interviews, I ended up doing a lot of MMIs, so I'll talk a little bit more about MMIs. A lot of times with MMIs, I think when I was doing prep, I got a lot of sort of questions regarding really ethical dilemmas, and even sometimes like group activities where you have to like work with other people and sort of guide them. And I'll be totally honest, when I was doing my actual interviews, I didn't really get any of those. And I know that I myself had sort of freaked out about doing those sort of group activities. So I think that's one thing that, I think Annie mentioned earlier about reaching out to current students and seeing what their experience is like. When you reach out to current students, especially like MS1s or MS2s, you're going to get the most fresh and recent information about what interviews actually will look like versus what that may look like at a different school, what it might look like from other people who are just guessing what's happening at a school. So definitely do that. With MMI questions, one thing that I found super helpful, especially when it came to ethical questions, was that I realized that people weren't really trying to figure out whether or not I knew the ethics or even knew the specifics around every single topic that they asked me. It was more they were just trying to pick my brain about my thought process. And so this will sort of help with like Casper, if that's one of the standardized exams that you'll have to take during your medical school application time too. But really being able to articulate what exactly you're thinking about, how you're sort of breaking down a problem, what are the different issues that you see that are happening, how you're going to work around every individual issue, and then wrapping that up and then coming up with an actual solution for like an action plan for what exactly you're going to do. As long as you're able to sort of break all that down, do it succinctly, and also make sure that it's understood by the other person who's listening, I think that you're going to do great on MMIs. A lot of these interviews are less technical and more behavioral in the sense that people just want to know who you are, what you do and sort of what you represent and how that's going to fit into their sort of broader medical school community.
Does anybody have anything else to add? Awesome. So just a quick to cover the other ones. Traditional interview is like an interview one-on-one with somebody where you're having a conversation for like 20 to 30 minutes. A lot of those questions are pretty behavioral. Who are you? And kind of what are your reasons to going to the school? For group interviews, it's kind of having an interview with like multiple interviewees. And so it's kind of looking at group dynamics as well. The next question I have is regarding how do you manage the stress before and during an interview? And does it get easier as your interview cycle progresses?
So I could take this one. So before interviews, I always tried to, I guess, just get out of my room and try to do something fun. Definitely a way for me to kind of relax before the interview the next day. And then a lot of times on interview days, you'll have maybe hours before you start interviewing. And so before then, I'll try to go outside, take a deep breath, and then try to settle myself before going into the interview. And kind of as your cycle goes, interviewing definitely gets a lot easier. I think your first one is probably the most nerve-wracking. And so over time, I think you'll build confidence and things will get better.
I would definitely echo what Chris said. And then also, like, it sounds kind of silly, but I would have like a dance party in my room before interviews on Zoom. And like, I would play music that would just like hype me up for a couple minutes and just like get in a happy mood and excited and like kind of like stand in front of the mirror and smile. And like, there's a lot to be said about, you know, that feedback that you give yourself when you like are smiling, you're standing with good posture, you can fool yourself into feeling confident even if you aren't. So that's something I definitely recommend doing before the interview. And then leading up to it, I think honestly for me, what really helped was acquainting myself with the school as much as I possibly could before the actual interview. So whether that was talking to students or faculty or just like doing as much research as I possibly could about the school online, that just made me feel a little bit less blind going into it.
Yeah, I think like a few other things I did to like reduce stress is like try to have, if your interview's on Zoom, just try to have your like Zoom set up a little bit prepared ahead of time because technology challenges like happen and it's really stressful when those happen like in the moment. So maybe doing like a trial run before with your Zoom, make sure you have like, you know, your laptop charger, all that. And another thing which I didn't totally think about before like my first Zoom interview is that you really do have time to like snack and have water. So like have some snacks like on the side out of the frame and stuff. And there'll be times where you're like switching in between and out of Zooms and can turn off your camera for a few minutes to like have some food. Obviously don't be like eating and while you're interviewing, but your interview day is like several hours and your actual interview is only like a fraction of that. So have your snacks like planned out, you know, make sure they're accessible. And then one thing that helped me is some schools will give you the name of who's going to be interviewing you beforehand. And sometimes you'll get it like at the start of the day and your interview will be in the afternoon, or sometimes you'll get it ahead of time. So if you kind of just like look through the document, sometimes you can find it. And I wouldn't go like too crazy researching them a ton and knowing everything about them. But I think like knowing maybe like what department they're part of, and honestly, just like knowing how they look, it can, and then when they join the Zoom, it's a little bit more comforting than just meeting like an absolute total stranger. So maybe familiarizing yourself a little bit with like their department, like are they an MD, are they a PhD? Like have they been at the school for several years and stuff like that? Stuff along those lines. Oftentimes like a little bit of a tangent, but this is in regard a little bit to the last question as well, but oftentimes for traditional interviews, at least, you'll get paired with an interviewer for a reason. So maybe you'll like both have research in a similar field, or maybe you're clearly interested in a specialty that they're part of, or just like maybe they went to the same undergrad as you. Like there's a bajillion different reasons. But if you can like quickly glean why you might be paired with them, then you have already like a common ground with your interviewer, which I think can be like really comforting and a lot less stressful when you're like in the throes of like being in an interview.
Another one that I would add is maybe having a conversation with somebody that you really love and supports you before your interview, and just kind of getting pumped up that way. I think that a lot of times when you're going through the interview process, you are kind of forced to be very self-analytical, like analyze yourself a lot and be very critical. But right before an interview, it's good to feel good about yourself and be proud of everything that you've done. And that was something that was really helpful for me. I also tend to love being with animals, so I would have my dog in the room, which sometimes is a distraction, but most of the time was really helpful for me. Those are most of the questions that we're going to have for like before the interview. And so I kind of want to focus the meat of it to during the interview and after, if that's okay with everybody else. Feel free to add comments if we missed anything. But the first question I have is, what is an interview that you had that was great, and what do you feel made that a great interview experience?
I'll get us started with this. I think something that made me feel like it was a great interview was when the interviewer was really just trying to get to know me as a person. And this is going to be variable from school to school, because some schools do actually have very structured interviews where even though it's a one-on-one, it's traditional, but they sort of go through a list of questions and that's sort of just what they have to do. But it didn't make me feel great. I think a lot of those interviews, I always left them thinking to myself, did I answer the questions correctly? Did I get across what I wanted to get across? And so I actually had a couple interviews that I really enjoyed where it was simply the other person trying to get to know me as a person. So I remember, probably one of my best interviews was I like immigrated from Taiwan to the States. They asked me like sort of like what that whole thing was like what's it like to move from a different country, uproot yourself, and then come to a different country. And we really got to talk a lot about that experience. And it was amazing to feel like my interviewer actually wanted to get to know me as a person rather than just me as like a list of stats or a list of like accomplishments. Though albeit we've worked so hard for all these things that you obviously want to talk about those things. Something that also helped for me a little bit to feel like I had good interviews was when I myself had like an agenda. Obviously, the interviewer is going to dictate where they want to take the interview and sort of like what questions they're going to ask. But I think that if you can sit down and just take a couple of notes about what are like the big, let's say there's three things. What are the big three things that I want someone to know about me? It doesn't have to be accomplishments. It doesn't have to be awards. It could just be, honestly, it could be that you're a nice person, or it could be that you love talking to people or getting to know people. And just making sure that like somewhere along your interview, if you just have like a post-it note of like these three things on your wall, and then you could think to yourself, like, how do I tie these three things into my interview? So that even though my interviewer is asking me a question about something else, this is what I want to bring up, and I'll have some sort of activity or have some sort of experience to highlight how like these are three important things to me. And that made me feel like I was able to get who I was as a person across. And as long as I was able to do that, I honestly felt like I had a good interview.
All right, so thank you so much, Randy, for sharing that. Those are really good points. To try and have something and a goal in the interview really seems like something that you can at least feel like, hey, did I do this or did I not? The other question that I have for you is kind of the other side of the coin. We all have great interviews and we all have interviews that don't go so well. So if you feel comfortable, I would really appreciate hearing, what was a bad interview that you had and how did you overcome it?
I can start with this one. It wasn't necessarily a bad interview, but it was something that, I had to overcome throughout the day. For one of my interviews, misinterpreted the time zone. I did not know Detroit was in the time zone that it is in, so I showed up an hour late. It was embarrassing and it was awkward. However, I apologized. They understand that mistakes happen. The interview actually ended up like going well, and it was really not the interview itself that was the problem. It was my poor planning. I ended up getting into the school. So that's like the big takeaway there. Something can go massively wrong in your interview day. And if you can like handle it with grace and as much professionalism as you can muster after something embarrassing like that, you can still have a good outcome. So don't let it derail your day. You just got to get back on the horse and keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jordan. Another question that I have is during the interviews, some schools have both student and faculty interviews, and do those have different weights in the application process?
I did interview at a school where I had a faculty interview and a student group interview. So I interviewed with two other applicants with a student. And I actually can't say for certain how much weight, like by percentage, because I didn't end up attending that school. So I don't really know. But advice I would give in relation to that is I would treat every interaction that you have on your interview day as if it has 100% weight on your application. And that also includes when you're in the large group room, because what happens at a lot of schools is you'll get put in this one large Zoom room to begin with. It could be, a dozen or even more, a few dozen people on your interview day. And then you might hear from some faculty members, you might get some intros, you might have a couple presentations about the school. And it's really important during that time that you are acting as if one person has their eyes on you the whole time. If you're distracted, if you're like texting, they can see like light reflecting off of your face. It's very clear. So that's just some advice I would give, is definitely take it super seriously. Don't underestimate it just because you're on Zoom. You are still being evaluated the whole time. So yeah.
I'll just emphasize something based on what Annie just said. Especially with in-person interviews, sometimes they'll host like casual events. I put quotes around casual during the evenings. If you have like a 2-day type of in-person interview, um, I think a lot of times folks will tell you that, hey, like no one involved in the admissions process is sort of at these events. The school that I interviewed at definitely had people who were sort of like watching while you're sort of like intermingling with other folks. So just be aware that, especially when you have an in-person event, every single interaction, I think Annie said it great. Every single interaction that you have with every single person, whether that is faculty, staff, just people who work at the front desk with admissions or even logistical things, volunteers, other students, every single interaction that you have is an opportunity for someone to possibly observe that you didn't do something that they loved, and jot that down and make it as a note on your file. So that I'm not trying to say that for you to be very cautious of what you do, but just be aware that every single action that you do during the day for in-person events can definitely have some sort of ramification.
And then kind of a question that's on here is, how do you navigate group interactions during interviews? What are interviewers looking for? What are things that you should prioritize?
Yeah, I can kind of elaborate on what I was saying about the group interview that I did. I did end up getting accepted to the school where I had the group interview at. So some advice that I would give is to have good self-awareness. So I think mine was on Zoom. So that obviously comes with some, limitations. It can be really awkward, if you don't want to talk over someone. There can be logistical muting things, like just roll with the awkwardness if that does happen. It's totally normal. But that being said, I think it's important to have a self-awareness of knowing, how much space to take up, how much is appropriate, and you really just want to stay balanced. So while it's important to make sure that you are, outshine, like not outshining, but shining yourself and like showing the best of who you are in a group, you also don't want to, take up too little space and let people show off more than you, because unfortunately you are being evaluated against the other applicants. But with that, I also would say it's really important to be super pleasant and friendly and interested in the people in your group interview as well. So something that I did was like, there would be 3 applicants with 1 med student, and we would each have to answer a question. And while another applicant was answering a question, I would be as engaged as possible with what they were saying. I would even ask a follow-up question, or like tell them like, oh, that's really cool that you shared that. Like, thank you for sharing that with us, something like that, to show the program and the med student that you're not just there, to compete. You're there because you're interested and you care.
To add on to Annie, because I think Annie made some great points, not only like, stating that you value the other people's opinion, but really truly actively listening to them and showing that you can work well in a group dynamic. So much of medicine is navigating group dynamics, and what they really want to see, I mean, I can't speak for admissions offices everywhere, but if I were in their shoes, I'd want to see that the applicant knows how to respectfully, cordially, and professionally handle themselves in a group environment. I'm sure you are all respectful, cordial, and professional people. So it's a matter of, pushing through and making sure that you can act comfortably and naturally in that environment as well.
Those are all really good insights, and it's kind of a question that is kind of navigating that, but is like, if you do have an awkward interaction, or like you misspeak during an interview, or you have an embarrassing event that occurs during the interview, how would you recommend approaching that going forward during the interview day and following the interview day?
I did have a situation where I remember during my very first interview, I got asked a question and I started to answer the question, and then I could just tell like it was not going to go where I wanted it to go. And so I actually took a pause and I asked the interviewer if they could repeat the question. And then I said, it's okay if I think about this for a second. I just took a few seconds to think about it. And that was a really stressful, like scary situation, because that's just a lot of pressure when you don't know how to answer a question. But I think that it was a really important lesson that messing up or like fumbling on a question or needing to ask for it to be repeated to does not have to set the tone for the rest of your interview. So really taking, one question at a time. And even if one situation feels like you might have fumbled, you can absolutely, demonstrate so many of your strengths and so many great qualities about yourself in the next one. So don't feel like it's a zero-sum game. And if you, say one wrong thing or feel silly about one thing, that it's going to ruin your chances, because it's not.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that when you're interviewing, you're like your own worst critic. And a lot of the stuff that you probably think sounds awkward probably is not awkward. And there's so many like worse ways that it probably like could have gone, and it probably went a lot better than you thought. So like I don't know if this would work for everyone, but I feel like as I was interviewing, like they would ask me a question, I'd answer it, and in my head I would just be like, that was the best answer ever, and then I would just go to the next one and I was like, that was the best answer ever. And you just have to like tell yourself that, even if that's not the case, like who cares, like if you messed up, if it's not the best answer, like you just need to like tell yourself that you up until this point you've done perfectly, you've killed it, like you're doing amazing, now you just got to keep on doing amazing, and you have to just like put it in the past, so like I would try to not let messing up or awkwardness or anything like set the tone or like bring that into the next questions. And if you're maybe someone that like is really nervous about potentially doing that, then like in your prep while you're doing mock interviews, tell the person who's mock interviewing that and say like if I get awkward, I'm worried about like carrying this in, like can you like try to create like an awkward dynamic or something? Like, you know, your prep is supposed to help you. So if you are worried that that's going to happen, then practice doing that and practice like a transition back to like carrying the question forward. So yeah, just like it doesn't matter if you mess up. Everyone messes up. Just like tell yourself you're doing amazing. You probably actually are doing much better than you think you are. And that would be kind of my advice for that.
I love that. Try and get those situations created beforehand, and also just keep pumping yourself up throughout the interview. Kind of going into like more specific questions that you can get asked during the interview. I know we talked a little bit about tell me about yourself and kind of highlighting the specific things that you want your interviewer to take away by the end of the interview. Another question that comes up a lot is why us, or why this particular school? Do you guys have any recommendations on how to prep for those types of questions and what they're looking for?
Yeah, I think this is where what Annie mentioned earlier about reaching out to current students is really going to help you. I think that websites are great. Unfortunately, a lot of websites are very outdated. And actually, some opportunities that you see on websites might not even exist anymore. So it's really great to be able to reach out to people, especially if you have connections already. And if you don't have connections, one thing that I found very useful was reaching out to student affairs or even admissions and just asking them to see, hey, are there any current students that you'd be willing to sort of share their contact with and I could reach out to? A lot of schools have like student ambassador groups, and so they'll have a couple people already in mind. Another thing that also helps is if you have a specific interest in mind already, just telling them what that interest might be, and that might help them pair you up with someone who's more inclined. So let's say you're someone who's like, I'm going to do research during school. I know for sure I'm going to start on day one. I need to know what are the best opportunities that are available for me to do that. You might want to say that you're research oriented and you just want to have a better idea of the research landscape. That way, the school can better pair you up with someone who does that. One thing to keep in mind though is some schools might not pair you up with anyone. So you might have to be a little bit creative about how you reach out to people. I think it was mentioned before that LinkedIn was a way to do that. I think it's great to reach out to people that way and sort of personalize your messages too, so that people know that, you know, this isn't just some mass generated message that you're sending to every person. Another thing that I found very helpful too was I like to think of it sort of in three ways. One thing was for my own sort of specialty interests. What are the opportunities that are available at the school? Another thing is I really enjoy mentorship. And so what is an opportunity for me to get involved in mentorship for you? It could be like a hobby or anything like that, that you're interested of getting to be involved in more if you like research, for example. Another thing that I sort of mentioned already, but hobbies. So for me, like I really enjoy ceramics. So one thing I asked people was, are there ceramic studios nearby? You can imagine most people don't know the answer to that, but I thought I'd shoot my shot and see if anyone knew, because it'd be something important for me about where I wanted to sort of end up.
I think additionally, answering why us, the most important thing is that you answer authentically. Obviously, if you're at that interview, you want to go to that school for some reason. So find like reasons that are true to yourself. For example, applying to UCLA, going into that interview, I actually would put a sticky note on my computer screen of like 4 points of like why UCLA. Mine was I wanted to work with urban underserved populations. I cared just as much about health equity as I did about research. And those are two really highly emphasized parts of DGSOM's curriculum and resources. And I went to undergrad in Southern California. I think I forgot to mention that in my intro. I went to Scripps College, really small liberal arts women's, historically women's institution. But it meant that I had a really strong support network here. I understood medical school was going to be hard, and I wanted to be around people that I knew, understood, and already like was familiar with. So those were my answers. I felt really, truly earnest about them, and I think that came through.
Yeah, just to add on a few more points to that, I think that what you're saying, like I'm really like when you're interviewing and you're saying like I'm super interested in like, I don't know, the example of ceramics or like urban health equity. Like when you say that, like you're really, really interested in some of the programs at the school that you're interviewing at, make sure that there's like some part of your application or that you've like talked about it. Because if you're like so excited to do research at the school and it's an awesome research institution and you can't wait to get involved in research, and that's like a big reason why you want to go there, but you've never done research, it looks a little bit weird. So I would think like maybe like look at some of the stuff that you really like that you've already done, and does the school offer that? Most medical schools are like so comprehensive and have like way more resources than your undergrad, so likely they do offer that. So try to find maybe like something at the school that would cater to some of the stuff that you've already done. And it's very natural then to say like, it's obvious why you would like that. And then also it kind of gives you a shot to talk a little bit more about your application, and tie that in a little bit. I think that just a general piece of advice is just when you're answering like the why us or why like why the school, don't only talk about the school, like talk about you. Be like, I want to go here because they have this program and I like this because of this. Don't just say like, I like this program, they have this program as well. Like tie it back to yourself. And then the other thing that I just wanted to add is it's awesome talking to students and researching and looking at the website. And when you're answering the questions, like feel free to add that. Say like, well, I was looking at the website and I found under the urban health equity pathway that you can do this capstone. And I was reading about some of these capstones on the website, blah, 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 blah. Or you can say like, well, I'm really interested in UCLA and I spoke with some of the current students and they told me about this program and I couldn't find it on the website, but it sounded really interesting. Like, feel free to like shed some light on some of the work and prep that you did that like exemplifies why you want to go to that school beyond just being interested in some of the programs and opportunities that the school has.
That was all really insightful answers. Like, I think that having that post-it note and kind of connecting and taking the time to talk to people is really helpful in figuring things out. And I know that a lot of students at UCLA are very, very happy to answer all of your guys' questions too. It's kind of a community where I feel like people are way more are kind of overboard with the help that they offer. I think something that came up that, at least in my head, is it sounds like you guys had a very easy, like very methodical way of answering some questions. And I don't know if you have some tips and tricks for how to approach a question that, you know, you weren't expecting, and how to kind of stay calm and also answer the question in a way that you can kind of fit in some of that information that you do want to include in your interview.
If you are feeling stressed about answering a question or you need a second to compose your thoughts, it's okay to take that second of just silence and like tell your interviewer, like, that's a great question. I need to think about it for a moment. And for me, at least, I felt much better about sitting in silence for a couple seconds, thinking of a well thought out answer than trying to think while it was coming out of my mouth on camera, being judged. That was a much more anxiety producing situation for me. So you're not always going to have a right answer to everything. A lot of the questions are built to not have a right answer, and that's okay. I think a question I was given once was like, if you had to make a documentary right now, what would it be about and how would you structure it? Obviously, that's like not a med school application question I was expecting. So I had to think on my feet. I did take that like 5 seconds of like, okay, collect my thoughts. What do I do? However, it can also be really helpful to have frameworks for questions that you might not be expecting, but then you can structure your answer and kind of figure it out as you go. Something that my pre-health advisor from undergrad recommended is find like 2 or 3 salient points from your answer, list them in the first thing. So like for that documentary question, it could be, well, I think that blank, blank, blank is important, and this is how I would structure it. That would be like your one-liner opener, and then give detail for no more than 1 minute.
Adding on to what Jordan said, I kind of went a different route. What I would do is I would repeat the question back to the interviewer while I was thinking about what I was going to say. And when I was prepping for interviews, I would kind of go through like stories that I mentioned on secondaries or just stories that I had in general, and different and how those stories would answer different themes. And so usually while I was repeating that question back to the interviewer, I would kind of select which story I was going to use and how I was going to frame it to best answer the question.
Yeah, I sort of went down Chris's road. I very often will say that's a great question that you asked to sort of buy myself some time. And then I think one thing that I tried to do was, especially with the curveball questions, I would like very quickly try to think like, what are they trying to get at? Like the documentary question, like what are they trying to get at? And I was like, oh, okay, maybe they're trying to figure out what's really important to me, or what are things that I would want to bring up. So I'd be like, okay, well, that's actually a much easier question now instead of trying to figure out like, do I want this to be like a true crime series or like whatever I was trying to do. So definitely, if you can, try to think real quick about what exactly are they trying to get at, and then you have this whole repository of basically your whole life, and all these experiences that you have that you know like the back of your hand because you did it. So then it's just a matter of picking out the right thing and how do you really phrase that in a way that still answers their question while still being able to get across the point that you want to get across.
So kind of building off of that, it sounds like we prep a lot of questions. We have some unexpected questions in interviews. How do you prevent yourself from sounding stale or too rehearsed during interviews? I know that that's a big concern for a lot of people going into the interviews, is that they prep too much, or, you know, how do you figure out how to stay fresh, I guess?
One way that I did this was because this was something I was worried about, was that I didn't want to under prepare and kind of go blank, because I'm the kind of person that tends to freeze when I freak out and then I can't think and I like just totally blank. And I also didn't want to sound rehearsed or scripted. And I knew that that was really important, because one way to really establish rapport and like a relationship with your interviewer is to have a conversation, right? Not to be answering just a question like a robot. So what I did was I would do like this flashcarding system where on flashcards, I would write common interview prompts that I thought I might be getting or that I could get anywhere. And then on the other side of the flashcard, I would just brainstorm random anecdotes or stories that I could possibly use to answer that question. So I wouldn't write out how exactly am I going to say or tell this story, but I would think maybe 2 to 4 different things that I've done or experiences I've had that relate to that theme or that topic. So that way I was just allowing myself to kind of like just churn on it a little bit and, you know, get all of that brainstorm up in my head. So that way, when I went into the interview, I felt like I had this like vault of stories and anecdotes and experiences that I could pull from rather than pulling from a script that I memorized.
I had never heard of that chat strategy before, and I think it's actually really helpful because you have those bullet points and kind of that repository of stories that Randy was talking about, and you kind of already link it to different prompts. Super helpful. There's been a bit of questions also in the RSVP about particularly prepping for UCLA interviews. I don't know if you guys have any like tidbits that were helpful for you for your interviews for UCLA. I know there's some the prime program, the normal MD program, as well as the MD PhD program. And I don't know if there are any specific tidbits that you wish you had known before your interview or things that you found really helpful for prepping for the UCLA interview.
Something a little bit general, but for traditional interviews, typically it's going to be either open or closed file. So you usually will know, I think, I don't want to say that 100%, but I think most schools will tell you if it's going to be the case where your interviewer has already read through your application or if they have no idea, all they've got is your name. So I knew that UCLA's interview for me would be open file, meaning that my interviewers have already read my whole application before meeting me. So the biggest way I prepared was knowing that thing like the back of my hand. So being able to defend anything I wrote in any essay, being honest with myself about what my weaknesses were, and then also being you know, hyping up my strengths and the things that I wrote about that I cared about. So I think that was really helpful because they ended up asking me a lot of questions about very specific things in my application and wanted to get to know me deeper. So be able to elaborate and defend anything that you've put in your application because you will get asked about it.
Yeah, just to add off of that, one of my interviews like knew my whole application like the back of their hand, and then the other one like didn't really. So they kind of knew it. The reason I bring that up is because you'll get open file interviews, and I just wouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that they will have like known everything about your application, because some of these interviewers are interviewing like, you know, 30 people that day, and they took 10 minutes to read your application or something, or someone's sick and they're filling in or something like that. Like at a different school, I had an interview that was open file, and it was my very first interview, and I went in thinking that they were like, I was ready to like defend all the parts of my application, and I thought they were going to like be so nitpicky, and they really just had like glanced at my application and they like saw a few key points. So some you'll get like all across the board, like all different ranges. But I think that just as a respectful common courtesy, when you're answering the questions, maybe don't fully assume that they know everything about your application, because they might not, and they might just kind of know some of the titles of the things that you've done, and they may not have remembered the small stories that you've shared in your personal statement or in your activities. So just it's okay to talk about the stuff that you wrote in your application, even if it's just open file.
Yeah, and then just to throw an MSTP side of things in there is, you know, review your research. If you are an MSTP applicant, they will ask you about your research. Be curious, ask questions. A lot of the time it's an exchange and conversation about the research, but also about all the other opportunities available at the institution. At UCLA, it was much more of a conversation about what life at UCLA would be like, what their available resources were, and then you had different interviews as well with specific faculty. Open versus closed. I think that open, the way I approached it was being able to maybe have like a couple of jumping off points, kind of like Elena said, versus having an expectation that they knew everything about me. And then for closed interview, it's kind of honestly a privilege because they don't know anything about what you wrote. So you can kind of use the exact same stories if that's something that you're interested in, or if you want to modify some things, you can feel free to do that as well. But it's honestly I think of it as kind of like a meeting of the minds between the interviewee and the interviewer, and it really depends on how both of you like approach the interview. And sometimes it's what you expect, and sometimes it's absolutely not what you expect. Kind of also going off of during the interview, a lot of times you get the opportunity to ask questions specifically to your interviewer. What are some questions that you asked your interviewers at the end of your interviews? And did you have any differences if it was a faculty member, if it was somebody from admin, or a student?
This is not an answer to that question, but adding on to what you were talking about knowing your research. Also, if you're not an MSTP applicant, but you do have a lot of research on your activities section, know your research well. Occasionally, instead of having an MD faculty or a MD student interview you, I had a couple schools that had professors with PhDs interview me, and I had a lot of research. I was working in a research position at the time, and one of them I was actually interviewing at the institution where I worked, and the PhD professor was a colleague of my PI. So he knew my research really well, and I was like on my toes, even though I knew my research while I was working in it then. So make sure you know the ins and outs of your research. Make sure you know if like that was, I think, the one instance in all of the open file interviews I had where I did feel like, oh goodness, I really need to know my own stuff. The rest of the open file interviews I had were pretty laid back. I kind of got the vibe that many of the people like skimmed over and then were more excited to, talk to me and get to know me face to face, not face to face, rather than through the application.
Can you repeat the question, Sophie?
Yeah, of course. I was
Thank
just
you.
saying like, yeah, that's actually a very good point that I never had a colleague interview me for med school and I was thinking of how stressed I'd be. In terms of the question, it was at the end of interviews, a lot of times you have the opportunity to ask questions to your interviewer. What questions did you typically ask, and did that differ between if it was a faculty member, a person from admin, or a student?
This might not be totally applicable across the board, so obviously take this with a grain of salt, but this is kind of like what not to ask, because I was given advice by some people or like by a pre-health counselor to ask the faculty interviewer something along the lines of like, you know, what brought you here and what has kept you here, if they're a faculty who's been at the school for a while. And originally I thought that was such a good question because I would learn, you know, if they've been at the school for 25 years, it must be a wonderful environment. It must be great. It might tell me something about the school. And while I think that could be true, I did ask that in multiple of my interviews, and the answers I got really were never much more than like, my family's from here. I wanted to live here. I got married and then I settled down here and my kids went to school. You know what I mean? Like I didn't actually end up learning a lot about the school. And usually people end up where they are because that's just where they want to plant their roots. Sometimes it is a reflection of the program. But so I would say if that is a question you want to ask, it's definitely not a bad one, but just prepare that maybe they may not give you the insight you were looking for, because I had that happen to me and I was kind of like, maybe I could have asked a different question.
Yeah, in terms of asking questions, I think that in general, when you're like not sure if you should do something or not do something, if there's like any opportunity that you can showcase yourself a little bit more during your interview, I would take advantage of it. So whether that be like sending a thank you note or asking questions, I think that times when you shy away from further like showing them who you are, it's a little bit telling. So yeah, I would find like some generic questions about the school that you could probably ask to like a few faculty already prepared going in, so that way you're not like rambling to think of a question at the end. And then as you're going through the interview, if they are talking about something, or if they have like a background in a certain field or something like that, that's always really interesting. If you find like the one caveat or one thing that I would try to like make you aware of is if you ask something that's like right on the homepage of the website, or very, very easy to answer yourself, it may reflect a little bit poorly on you. So I would just I would ask a question, but if you're not sure if the question's too simple and it's like already broadcasted on the website or something, maybe try to pivot and ask a more personal question to them, like how do you choose your specialty, or like what is it like getting involved in research at UCLA, or I don't know. It's like any personal question that's less like quantitative that you could just Google and find out on the website, like how many students there are or something like that. So yeah, that would be like kind of my guidance to asking questions. Overall, I think you should.
Yeah, I agree with everyone who shared. Definitely have some sort of question prepared. I think the last thing that you want to do is someone asks you, do you have any questions? And you're like, nope, can't think of anything. Just have something. One thing that this might be a personal opinion of mine, but I wouldn't think too much about the questions. I think along the similar lines of what Annie was mentioning earlier about like, hey, like what kept you here? Um, I also had a lot of questions where I was like, hey, what would you change if you could change it? What are things that you think the school does well or doesn't do well? What clubs are there if I'm interested in this, or, you know, is there this sort of community clinic or something? And I'll be honest, I don't think I ever got a good answer for any of those questions, because a lot of faculty, they're just faculty. They weren't really involved in like these clubs. They weren't involved in clinics. They weren't involved in, you know, XYZ research. And so if you ask them a question, they'll be like, yeah, I'm sure there's some sort of research that's happening based on, you know, whatever your interest is. So I wouldn't think too much about these questions. I think really it's an opportunity for you to maybe just show that you know a little bit about the school, you looked into it, maybe you talked to a current student, you talked to some faculty already, and it's just a way for you to sort of show your interest. But I think that it'll be a little bit hard to sort of get like really concrete information about things that you're interested in outside of really current students, is my opinion.
I agree with what Randy said. I think that the one question that I had always was, how did students impact an institution? Because it kind of shows you how they value students at the school. And I think that that kind of relayed with everybody that I talked to, with students. This is something that I talk to everybody that about is asking about resources for when students are struggling or how they approach students who are having trouble. Because you want to know if you have access to academic affairs and tutoring, and if you have access to mental health resources, or how is the student clinic, how do students have insurance, like how is your life going to be when you hit a rough spot? Because everybody in medical school hits a rough spot. It just depends on what flavor of rough spot they're going to hit, and knowing what those resources are can be really helpful to know going into your decision on whether you want to go to a school or not. A lot of schools have the same things, but if students don't, like, if people aren't able to speak on them, it also shows about the accessibility of them. At least that's my opinion. And then I know faculty aren't very useful in terms of getting intel as what it's like as a student, but current students are really helpful, and admin can also be helpful. And so I'd get ready for questions for them. Another question kind of to tie things up is, after the interview, what are things that you recommend students do in terms of right after the interview? And then as a follow-up question, we can talk about what to do between when you get your interview and when you're waiting for a decision, because I think that that's also a very turbulent time for people.
I can speak to this because I interviewed at UCLA in early October, October 2nd, and I got my acceptance on May 2nd. So it was a really long waiting period. It was kind of really hard to sit there without answers. However, it's important for like your own sanity and mental health to not fixate. Control the things that are in your control, write your thank you notes. But there's certain things that you're just not going to have agency over in this application process. That's the nature of it. And as hard as it is, just having to like let go of that feeling of control over the next 4 years of your life was something that like I had to do. I also made contingency plans. So I knew what I was going to do if I didn't get into UCLA. I knew what I was going to do if I did. I had plans for my move, all of that stuff. So I was prepared either way, and make sure that you have like a really good support network around you. I'm really grateful that I had phenomenal friends and family. I also am really grateful I had been accepted somewhere, so I knew I was going to be in medical school. But that waiting period, I can't tell you anything that's going to make it better or fix it. But the best thing you can do for yourself is just take care of yourself, rely on your loved ones for the support that you need, and be honest with yourself about how you're feeling.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think like one of the hardest parts about like just like the overall field of medicine is that it's such a field of like delayed gratification, and everything just takes so long for you to finally feel like so excited and gratified, whether that's like your MCAT score, studying for your MCAT, or like submitting your application. It's just a long path. And like I would try to urge you to find comfort in like the waiting and the delayed gratification of it all, because it's just like a theme in medicine, because then you get into medical school and then there's like the next hurdles that you have to get. And there's a delay in a lot of the times and you can feel really happy. So I would take comfort in that. And then I would also just like enjoy your time. Your gap year is like such a fun time because you have submitted your application, you're like have maybe finished all of your interviews and you're just waiting to hear back, and you can just like enjoy your life as much as you can, because the truth is like what you do during that time period like it won't really affect your application that much. And so you should just have a lot of fun and you should just enjoy your life, because if you end up getting in May, it'd be nice for you to look back and say like, wow, I just had 6 months of so much fun. Then like I just got in May, and the last 6 months I was miserable every day because I was just waiting. So I would encourage you to like try to stay busy, find things that you're enjoying. And then, yeah, kind of like what Jordan was saying, be realistic about your like your contingency plans. Know that what's going to happen if there's one outcome or the other. And yeah, focus on that, and then go to like have fun and stuff.
Yeah, I could speak a little bit about my experience. I was definitely on the side of being like, I am freaking out about where I'm gonna go because I'm not hearing back from anything. And it's past the New Year's already. Which to be fair, looking back, most of the people aren't gonna hear by New Year's, so I'm not sure why I was so worried about that. But I think one thing that helped me is I knew that in May time of sort of so May for y'all next year, if you're applying this cycle, nothing's really happening during that time. If anything, maybe you're planning your move and sort of leases and stuff like that. But for me, I was like, okay, regardless of whether or not I get into a school or if I don't get into a school, I am going to travel and have fun. So I spent all of January, February, March, April just basically being like, I'm going abroad and I'm just going to have fun somewhere, backpack around Europe, and just like have fun, treat myself for going through this whole process, regardless of what that result is. And I think that made me a lot more mentally sane than if I was just like sitting there without any sort of like reward down the line. Obviously, one of the biggest rewards is getting into school, but I was also like, if I don't get in, I still want to treat myself for, going through this arduous process. And that definitely kept me sane. And so if you're able to, I know everyone's financial situation is a little bit different, also time and obligations for other things. It doesn't have to be a big trip, but just some sort of thing to reward yourself for going through this process. I think having that sort of down there in the timeline helps a little bit with having something to look forward to.
And then we didn't really talk that much about thank you notes, but I think that the general vibe is send a thank you note if you had like a traditional interview. And then if it's an MMI, like oftentimes you don't even get their contact information or it's anonymous. So like it's okay. If you don't, you can send like a general thank you interview for like thank you note for like the institution hosting the interview, but it's not at all pressure. And then the last thing that I want to do, because we're over time, is I know we talked about a bunch of different topics, and we covered a lot of ground. But if any of the panelists have any like pearls of wisdom that they really want to share before we end tonight, that would be great. As well as feel free to leave your guys' emails if you're interested in having people contact you after the panel in the chat as well.
My pearl of wisdom is just to everyone, be kind to yourself through this process. It's really hard. It's agonizing for everyone. Everyone's on their own timeline. I took 3 gap years. There are people in our class who went straight through. There are people in our class who have PhDs. There are people in our class who are, 15 years out of school. And we're all going to end with MDs. We're all going to have incredible and unique careers. Do not hold yourself to other people's expectations or what they're doing. It's okay. And, just show yourself some grace.
Really quick, I would say my pearl of wisdom is really just be yourself. I think a huge part of the interview process is the school just wanting to know who you are, what your personality is going to bring to their school, what your interests are going to bring. So don't dim your shine. Of course, be very professional. But seriously, like I think that medical schools really care about the people they're bringing in, not the applicant, right? So be you, don't dim your shine.
Yeah, along those lines, I would just say that if you're getting an interview, it is so hard to get an interview from a medical school. If you're getting an interview, they are so interested in you. And don't spend time during your interview like wondering if you should have been there, like if it was a mistake that you were there, like if you didn't deserve it, like forget all of that, because they are so interested in you. If you got an interview, there's like so many other students who they would have interviewed in a heartbeat if they weren't interested in you. So just remind yourself that and like just be excited. And then the other thing that I would just remind yourself is that there isn't like one perfect applicant or like perfect med student. So when you're going through it, like don't compare yourself to anybody else. There's like such a range of people who get into medical school, who are going into medicine, and just remember that you're qualified, like you're picked for a reason, and that you're just like you're on your own journey and stuff. So yeah, good luck with everyone too.
I'll just echo that. Be confident, you all got this, and don't be afraid to, be yourself and be unique, and then you can answer things in ways that you think would be specific to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for being here, and thank you so much to our panelists. I learned a lot tonight. And if you have any questions, I think everybody left their email in the chat. I'll hang out for a couple more minutes for anybody to get any information that they need, but everybody can feel free to sign off. There's no more information that's going to be shared. But thank you guys all for coming.